Hello, it's Dakota Kershaw with Kershaw Instrumentation, and I'm here with you today to go over our technical discussion portion of our demonstration of our Tackmaster Model TM16U. The mechanics of this machine are more or less the same as our current models, our Tackmaster 92 and our Tackmaster 07, but with an added touchscreen PLC, our electronics and the functions are slightly different, but much improved. Now this portion of the video will give an in-depth description of all of the features and functions of this machine step by step, everything about test setup and everything excluding a test run, which can be viewed in our introduction video. So if you'll come with me over here to our touchscreen PLC, we can begin. This screen here is our mode selection screen, which for all intents and purposes is our home screen. Now we have four panels on here that you can select. One that reads test, test setup, test panel, and calibrate. In this portion of the video I will be going over the latter three, the test setup, test panel, and calibrate functions. And to view our test function, our introduction video is just available with this one as well. So the first one that we're going to go to is our test panel that we have down here in our bottom left hand corner. Click on the panel here and you'll see a whole array of different numbers and data points and things. And the purpose of this panel is simply a troubleshooting panel to make sure that everything is functioning the way that it should before you go and set up an automatic or manual test. There's several different buttons down the bottom here which all have different functions, which I'll go over. The first one we want to start with is this green button here, which is our jog button. By pressing and holding that button, it just ensures that our motor's working and all of our rollers are going around with no problems and just making sure all the mechanics work. And you let go and it stops. And then we have a test print message button. We press. It just assures that our standalone printer is printing the proper text. And our test print data, which is just making sure that our standalone printer is communicating with our PLC correctly. Now the other two buttons on the side here, there's no real function for an operator to use them. It's more for a technician standpoint, so there's really no reason for us to get into them right now. So I hit our return button and bring us back to our mode selection screen, and the next section we're going to get into will be our test setup. We click the test setup button and it brings us to this screen. Now you will see this screen many times when navigating around your PLC, and it's simply a password screen that allows the owner of this instrument to password protect any particular areas that he doesn't want an operator or whomever else to mess around with the settings or anything for the functions and features. So I'll enter our password here, and that opens up our screen. Now here we have different setup for each individual parameter of the screen, being temperature, speed, test time, all of those things. And the first thing that we're gonna see at the top here will be our temperature display button. Now what this button does is it basically just determines whether or not you want the temperature to be displayed here on the PLC, or if you want to just reference your standalone temperature bath, whichever you choose. And you can do that by selecting this here. Okay? Very simple. Now what we have beneath that are two automatic test setup screens. Now the reason we have two separate setup screens is because a lot of times people will run a test at high speed for a long period of time, or run a test at low speed for a short period of time, or they run tests with different calibration standards or what have you. And this allows us to pre-program the parameters of each test individually, so you can select between one or the other before you run the test, and you don't have to readjust the settings each and every time that you run a test if you choose to. Now I'm going to touch this auto test number 2 setup button, and that'll bring us into our test parameters themselves. Now on this screen you see we have three separate sections here. The first one will be our distribution speed and our distribution time. Both of these can be adjusted simply by clicking on the box, entering the number that we want, which we'll set to 400, and our time here, which I will change to 15. Below that we have our test speed, which is 1200, same thing, they can be selected as so, and our test time, which we have set to 1 minute. Now below our test time box, you'll see a green box here that says dry calibration. Now, when I get into the calibration portion of this video, I'll describe this in better detail, but this machine allows you to use two separate calibration methods, whether you want to use a dry calibration, which is established using a calibration bar like so, or an ink calibration, which allows you to use your ink standard calibration, both of which work independently from one another and can be toggled on and off during an automatic or manual test, which I'll get into in a minute. To change that on the automatic test setup, you can select dry or you can select ink. Now once this is set up, this PLC will remember these parameters, and anytime that you select your auto test number 2, which is the one we're in here, you'll get exactly these parameters. Same thing with auto test number 1. You know, they can be customized differently however you want to do it. Now before we go back to our mode screen, we'll take a look at this green box down here. This says auto test 2 enabled. If you only want to use one test setup instead of having to select between one or two, if you're really only running the same test over and over again consistently, you can disable this there, and that basically allows for you to select your automatic test without having to choose between one or the other. Now coming back to this screen, we'll direct your attention up here to this small yellow question mark in your top right hand corner. You'll see this appear several times throughout each different screen, whether in different locations on the screen, and the purpose of that is simply to answer any frequently asked questions about this machine. You see, if you have a question about this particular spot, you can open up this section, and it gives you several different lines of text that can hopefully answer any frequently asked questions there. Now, beneath our test setup, we have our memory and printer setup. Now, this machine has the option of coming with a standalone printer, which we have on this side here, which is more or less just a point-of-sale cash register printer. This is an old model here. The ones that we provide, if you opt for this model, comes with a much newer model. It's more modern and things, and functions are the same for demonstration purposes. So we'll go into this memory and printer setup here. And again, we have a list of parameters, and you see your help text down the bottom. The first thing that you see here is this says memory/printer on, and the purpose of that is if you don't have a printer for this machine, you don't have to worry about any of this, and you don't have to worry about your memory or so on. So you can select, toggle this on or off. Simple as that. Now, when you do have this toggled on, to the right of this, you'll see this says 15 seconds. This is set up for 15 seconds, meaning that every 15 seconds you'll get a printout, and you'll get your TAC on your screen will update. If you turn this memory off, you'll have your TAC in real time, so you can watch this as it changes throughout the test, or however you choose to do it. And this can also be changed simply by selecting the number here, and we'll change this to 10 seconds for demo purposes. All right. Now below that, we have set current date and set current time. And this PLC does come equipped with a real-time clock, which we have enabled, meaning that if this machine is turned off and turned back on, your time will still be accurate, but it is adjustable by selecting, just like anything else. So now your printout will have the date and the time, so you know exactly when each thing was printed, what day, and so on and so on. And your printout will also include something called the print header. Now, our print header is selectable here, and can be changed to more or less anything that you wish to change it to. And the purpose of that is so that our printout reads with, whether it be your company name or your batch ID or whatever it is. That way, when someone references your printout later, they can see what ink was run at what date and what time and for what interval and so on and so on. So this basically covers what you're going to see printed out on the slip from the printer after you run a test. Now I'm going to return now to our setup parameter screen, and we have one last section, which is our calibration setup. I'm going to select that, and again, several boxes that can be adjusted. The first one being our dry calibration, speed and time. Our speed is set for 1200, which can be changed, and our time is set to 25 seconds, which can be changed. And then below that, it will be our ink calibration distribution, meaning our ink will distribute for 15 seconds at 250 RPM. And below that is our ink cal test, which means our test will run for 1200 RPM for 30 seconds. And now the reason we have these two separate ones, again, is because we have two separate calibration settings that we can choose from, which I'll get into in just a moment. But this is how you set this is how you set up your whole calibration procedure. These are all changeable. A lot of times people have different calibration methods, whatever they may be, and they can all be set up from this screen here. Pretty straightforward. Now, on the bottom here, you'll see a yellow rectangle on your left bottom hand side of the screen, and it says TAC Reset. And the purpose of that is basically to avoid any major catastrophes with TAC calibration issues, if you have any. A lot of times these calibration numbers will get out of whack for whatever reason, and instead of breaking your back going through all the calibration parameters and trying to set things up, sometimes it's easier just to set it back to factory settings, which is exactly what we can do by pressing that button. This brings us back to the calibration that was established when the machine was built here in our facility, and for all intents and purposes is the bottom line, the bare bones version of the machine, which is very useful if a problem arises. Now, when we hit the return button, this brings us back to our mode selection screen, and we have one last section that we want to go over, which is our calibration section. Now, our calibration button is down here on the bottom right hand side of our screen. We select also password protected for the simple reason that a lot of times we don't want people from different departments or from different shifts changing your calibration settings and giving you different test results. Passwords are basically the same from screen to screen and can be changed by the operator themselves, but usually don't need to. That's more of a question that's more of a question for later. But for now, when we get into the screen, you'll see we have several different calibration modes here. One for your dry tack, one for your ink standard, one for your speed, and one for your temperature. I'm going to begin with the bottom two, simply because they're the easiest and they're very straightforward. The first one I'm going to begin with is our temperature calibration here, and when we click on this button, it brings us to a screen that gives us a portion of text. Now, every screen in the calibration mode will give you about a paragraph to explain exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it, and will walk you through step by step to make it as simple for the operator as possible, meaning that anyone can more or less calibrate this by themselves if they follow the instructions here. And because for demonstration purposes, I'll simply explain that you can touch this setting here, and you can change this to whatever you want our screen to read. Of course, we want it to read 90 degrees, and that will display in Fahrenheit. Basically, telling the PLC is basically telling the machine that the temperature that's coming in from our temperature probe and our external water bath is 90 degrees, and that's the number that it will be displayed on both the screen and the printer printout. I'm not going to go through the entire calibration because, just for demonstration purposes. Now we'll come back to this screen here, and we'll come to the speed calibration. Now I'm not going to click on the speed calibration and get into it because it's really straightforward, and for demo purposes I can simply explain that the way that this works is the speed calibration is selected, and the rolls begin to turn, and a sensor inside this machine communicates with the PLC, establishing an RPM based off of how quickly the motor is running and things like that. Very simple, and it's really a one and done procedure. You run through the speed calibration one time and you very rarely have to set it up again. And this machine is very stable. It can hold to around 5 RPM in either direction, and you usually won't see any issues with that changing at all. So with that being said, I'll move on to our tack calibrations here. The first one we're going to do is our dry tack calibration. Now I'm going to pan out so you can see the entire instrument here, and we'll go through these. Now, when calibrating this machine dry, you want to use something called a calibration bar. And for those of you familiar with some of the older models, it's slightly different, but the principles are all the same. This bar is simply a weight that's going to simulate a tack test and help us calibrate our machine so that we know that everything is reading the way that it's supposed to read. Now when we go into our dry tack calibration, again we will see a text screen that walks us through everything. This screen simply telling us that it's time for us to establish a 0. And by doing that, we want to engage our top roll, and then we will hit our calibration button. Now this is going to count down 25 seconds. Now that number 25 comes from our parameter that we set up in our test setup, calibration setup screen, like I had gone over before. We establish a time and a speed that we want to run at. That's where we're seeing this here. We got 25 seconds we're running, establishing a 0 for me, making sure that this machine is nice and steady before I decide to hang some weight on it. Alright, after 25 seconds, the rolls continue to turn, and we get to our second screen of text, simply stating that we're going to hang our weight on this device and calibrate to it. What's important about this is that these bars generally come in a 7.5 or a 15 gram meter bar, but some people do have some slightly different ones, and you can toggle between that simply by touching and putting in whichever number you want, which I will do 7.5. So if you have a 7.5 or a 15 or a 20 or whatever it may be, this is the place where you want to tell the machine which one you're using. Now taking our calibration bar, I'm going to take that and place it here on our calibration saddle, and I'm going to hit the continue button, which once I continue, this is for all intents and purposes running a mock test and simulating, using our bar to simulate attack rating. So now this is going to count down for 25 seconds, another parameter that was established in our setup screen, and as this runs, our device is establishing a position in the sensor that's telling us that this particular weight is 7.5 gram meters, and that's the number it's going to be looking for when this particular weight is assigned to this machine. Now as this counts down, our calibration is complete. Brings us to another text screen that basically tells us our calibration is all complete and that it should be reviewed in our manual test screen by going into a manual test and verifying it by hanging a bar on here, like I said, while running it manual, which is something that our test screen is something you can see in the introduction video we had. And then it also tells us we want to remove this bar here, and we want to hit the calibration complete button. This brings us back to our calibration selection screen. Now our dry tack is established, and that's one parameter that can be selected when creating a test. You can select between your ink calibration or your dry calibration. Our dry calibration being with our weight, which I had just gone through, and our ink calibration being what we are going to go through next. Okay, our ink calibration is top right here, and this brings us to a text screen that says to lower these rolls with no ink and to let it run for the desired time, which is 25 seconds. And this is simply, again, establishing a 0 for our as a reference point for our tack setup for an ink standard. And when this times out, it'll bring us to the next portion. You can see on the screen as this counts down, so there's really no confusion as to how long it's been sitting here. Everything counts down in real time, so it's very simple. Now this brings us to our next screen, which is in preparation for us to run a test with some ink on it. The text simply tells us to apply ink to the machine and press the continue button, which will go through, and run a calibration like it normally would. But here you also have these two boxes in the center. This one says yellow and this one says 14.5. Now these can be changed by clicking on them, and the purpose for them is so that you can title this. We have this titled yellow simply because the tack standard that we use here in house is yellow, just to avoid confusion. And I have this set to a 14.5 because that's the tack number that we're looking for upon calibration of this machine. Now, if you go through this calibration, or if one of your operators goes to run a test and the numbers come out different than they expected, they might be confused as to why, and if they want to find out which ink that they used to calibrate this or where the parameter was established, they can go back into either the calibration screen or this one here, and you can key in an ID number and a tack number and so on, which will also be, well, the calibration selection will be displayed on your printout as well. So if someone runs a test and the numbers are different, they'll be able to see the ID number, the number that was chosen, and they'll be able to see whether they chose the dry or the ink tack calibration on your printout. So now, before I hit that continue button, I'm going to apply some ink to this machine, just like I would do if I was running an automatic or manual test. This is our tack rated yellow here, and we use this for calibrating all of our instruments for the most part. Nothing different about this portion other than the fact that the PLC does all the work. I'll just give that a little turn, and now I will hit the continue button. Now this is going to distribute the ink for 15 seconds, which is the parameter, again, that I had set up in our test setup area. And this is just simply to, get a nice even spread, just like if you were running a test, no different. Now we're counting down 30 seconds. Now within this 30 seconds, it's running this ink, and the PLC is basically communicating with the sensor in the back and telling, or vice versa rather, and telling it that this yellow ink that we're running is the number that we keyed in the second screen of our ink calibration mode, meaning it was a 14.5, which is what I had put in here. May be different from location to location, but you understand the idea. Now, with all of this being done, this comes to a stop, and we get another text screen explaining that our calibration is complete. When we hit this, brings us back to our manual operation screen, and generally after the calibration is done, we'd like to verify this by running a very basic test in both calibration modes, which can be selected up here. If we want to verify ink, we select ink, and if we want to verify dry, we select dry. Now I'm not going to run a test on here just because we covered that portion in our introduction video, but as far as the details of all the functions of this machine, hopefully this video answered a lot of your questions as to what this machine is capable of doing and how simple it is to use, and also hopefully it answered a lot of questions about options that are available with this particular model. So with all of that being said, you are now trained and versed in the understanding of our new Tackmaster model, the TM16U, and hopefully we look forward to working with you. Thank you very much.